I'm here now with Sarah Hendel-Blackford. Hi, Sarah.
Hello, great to meet you.
You too, and thanks for being here on the conference. I hope you like it. You're Director of Systemic Risk Policy and Response at ASRA.
That's right.
Yeah. Yay. So, if I'm correct, then your work focuses on risk assessment and translating cross-sector fragility into practical policy and institutional response. Is it correct, more or less, what I'm saying?
It is, yeah, absolutely.
Okay. I have a starting question.
Yeah.
Why do governments and large institutions still struggle so badly with systemic risk when the evidence for interconnected vulnerability is already overwhelming?
That's a great question. I would say there's a number of reasons. I think, first of all, I would say ASRA, the Accelerator for Systemic Risk Assessment, we are a not-for-profit organisation that's really seeking to build our collective capacities and capabilities to identify, assess and respond to systemic risk. And that is part of the answer to your questions. I think we have lacked and lost a lot of our capacities and capabilities to think in terms of systems and to observe how systems are connected to each other. Mm-hmm. So I think to your question about governments and governance of these very broad interacting risks, governments have traditionally been set up to deal with risks one at a time. That's kind of traditional risk management approach, but systemic risks, which is essentially the potential for broad systems failure, cannot respond if you take a siloed approach. What we're interested in is that connective tissue. So how does one risk feed another that leads to entire system collapse or cascades into multiple system collapse? But governments traditionally have a Ministry of Environment and a Ministry of Finance and a Ministry of Education and so on and so forth. And when we get these siloed approaches, it certainly seems to be, in terms of the, it seems to simplify a complex problem. So this is why you have these different departments, but then you're missing all these interconnections. And if you have separate ministries, you have separate responsibilities. So accountability for how risks move from one system to another, who's responsible for that? No one. And from that, you have the resources, the funding flows, and so on and so forth are all directed in this kind of siloed manner. And I think that's the biggest failure. But certainly it comes from more, I think, of a more traditional risk approach, whereas systemic risk behaves in a very different way. Systemic risks are highly connected to each other. They feed each other. That makes it much harder to predict when the next risk is going to materialize, where and to what severity. So you've got a much more volatile behavior and much more complex. And so we do need to adapt our governance systems to think a lot more broadly and cooperate with each other across multiple disciplines and observe and take in information from multiple sources as much as we can to really understand how does risk move in terms of how quickly, where, and for whom across these different systems. And that's requires a lot of redesign, I would say, of our governments and governance systems.
Okay, I understand. But, okay, can you tell me what kind of redesign? So what would be a possible structure, or what would be some possible steps that we could make to make this work better and not to be so vulnerable in case of a systemic failure?
That's a great question, and I'd say there's many different answers to that, but essentially what we did at ASRA is we tried to look at the evidence base for what's got us to where we are now, which is, this polycrisis we're facing, a range of interconnected crises feeding each other. And we looked at the evidence base and put that together in a report called Facing Global Risks with Honest Hope, which really shows that our behaviours and governance systems thus far, in the majority, have been dominated by certain values and behaviours. So that's behaviours such as rule of the few, as I said, traditional siloed approaches, reductionism, let's go with what we know and what we can prove, and what we don't know we won't really look into.
Yeah.
Deep, long and historical extractivism for the benefit of the few. So that has been kind of the modus operandi for many governments thus far. So to your question about what should we be doing, that can be different things depending on how much agency an individual has, or an organisation, or a society, or a country, and the state of its government. However, at ASRA, the first thing we did is look at that evidence base and say, okay, what if we flip these behaviours and we'll think about what principles could act as guides for us to navigate us towards a safer place. So we developed collectively with the ASRA network the principles for systemic risk assessment and response. And there are 10 operating principles, which are really looking at, as I said, taking kind of almost flipping the behaviours we've seen thus far. So really embracing things like multiple perspectives, multiple ways of knowing, capturing knowledge from different sources, different communities, both human and non-human. Principles around the sanctity of nature, not just because it provides a range of services that we benefit from, but sanctity of nature in and of its own right. Principles around justice, so that can be structural, procedural, distributional justice. And so we have a range of these principles. That's a starting point in terms of, but that still feels quite broad. So to get into more specifics, we then, as a network, challenged ourselves to say, okay, how would these principles inform a different way of identifying and assessing systemic risks? So these are the risks, as I said, that have the potential to disrupt whole systems, be they natural systems, ecosystems, or man-made systems. So what methodologies, what approaches do we need, which are led and embrace these 10 principles that I mentioned? So we have developed an approach for systemic risk assessment. But once we've identified and assessed those systemic risks, there's another one, perhaps one of the greatest challenges: how are we going to respond to them? And for that, we then looked at, well, how would we even begin to identify an effective systemic risk response that seeks to limit these risks and transform to something safer and more just? How would we even know an effective systemic risk response if it was staring us in the face? What would it look like? And so we then thought about what characteristics, sort of key ingredients, that response could cover. And then we tested that against a range of what we thought might be interesting, effective systemic risk responses from completely different contexts. So from fragile states, from the multilateral world, from community grassroots projects, through to large, as I said, multi-government corporations, to see if the presence of these, what we call criteria for systemic risk response, are there, and if so, what does that tell us? So we have, as I said, developed these criteria. There are 14 of them, which we believe, having tested and applied them in these different contexts, both informal contexts at the local scale and formal in the international scale, we believe they hold. And I would say to your immediate answer to your question, so what is it that somebody could do, be they an organisation, a community-led group of people or a government or a range of governments, I would encourage them to look at the work that's been done. As I say, it's been done through a range of multidisciplinary experts in systemic risk across different domains, and that is embedded. Everything we do is open access. So there's a tool that anyone can use, whether it's to identify and assess systemic risks or just evaluate their own work to see if it's an effective response, whatever response that is, as I said, from whichever scale and context. And that's available online in the form of an online tool called STEER, which is the systemic tool to explore and evaluate risks. So I'd say as a very practical thing, that's the first thing that anyone can do. The other thing I would say on a very basic individual level, I would suggest that anyone can think about what systems are they part of as an individual. So that can be personally, professionally, at different scales. Again, formal systems that we've created, depending on where individuals live, informal systems, and think about where, as an individual, we have agency or influence or power. So at the very basic level, recognize we are all part of different systems. Systems we might not want to be in, systems that we may have made that are inherently harmful, but also natural systems. We're all part of this one planet that we depend on. And through recognizing all these different systems and trying to understand where we have agency, where can we move and have a positive influence, I think that's a really good starting point for people to try and see themselves as agents of change within the multitude of systems we have. And it becomes very quickly much more tangible and practical to people about where they have an influence and where they don't. How far away are they? Are they even involved in those conversations where people do have power and influence? And then if not, how can they get involved, or how can they work with others who can advocate and enable and fight for that genuine multiple perspective involvement?
All right.
That's a bit of a long answer.
Wow, yeah. I'm very sorry, but we have to wrap it up because it's like more than 15 minutes now.
That's gone fast.
It's a lot more, yeah. But what I want to say is that I really encourage everyone to check the description under the video, because all the links we'll get from you connecting to your work and this methodology will be there, and I strongly advise everyone to check them out, because if we need something, it's this change, in my opinion. And I would like to thank you very much that you are doing this, and have fun at this year's conference.
Thank you so much. It's a real honour to be here, and thank you for taking the time. I'm really excited to be here, part of this conference, and learn all the range of things that are happening. So
It will be really cool. Thank you.
Thank you.